Report 1. It was a cold autumn night when I, John Miller, a paranormal investigator with years of experience in unexplained cases, was invited to investigate the infamous Villa Puth in the small town of Blankenstein, in the Ruhr region of Germany. Together with my team, consisting of Emma, a specialist in EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, and David, our camera and technology expert, we were prepared for what we considered to be an ordinary night of investigation, despite the grim stories surrounding the estate. Villa Puth, a majestic 19th-century building, was shrouded in mystery. Heinrich Puth, the founder of the rope factory that boosted the local economy, was the former owner of the villa. It was believed that his spirit still wandered the grounds, accompanied by a ghostly dog with red eyes, a symbol of loyalty and perhaps repressed anger. Reports of apparitions, inexplicable flickering lights, and even the feeling of being watched by something beyond this world were common among the locals. When we arrived at the villa, the first thing that struck us was the oppressive silence. The cold wind blowing through the trees made the branches whisper secrets that seemed too ancient to comprehend. We decided to set up camp in the villa's garden, precisely where, according to legends, the apparitions were most frequent. Our tent was carefully positioned in an area that allowed us a wide view of the villa's surroundings. Little did we know that this night would mark our lives forever. Before we continue with more revelations about Villa Puth, I would like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and click the like button if you're enjoying the content. Your interaction is crucial for us to continue uncovering mysteries that challenge our reality. Don't forget to comment below which city you're watching from so we can see how far our terrifying stories reach. Now, let's dive even deeper into this fascinating story. As the night fully settled, we began to feel a strange tension in the air. The lights in the house, which had been off before, started flickering on their own, alternating between moments of complete darkness and sudden flashes. Emma, who was usually skeptical of such phenomena, tried to focus on capturing sounds with her EVP equipment, but even she was visibly uncomfortable. "Do you hear that?" David asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. He had set up cameras around the tent to capture any movement. When I looked at the monitor, what I saw made me freeze. A dog with red eyes, with a hollow and angry gaze, was standing just a few meters away from us, staring directly into the camera lens. The animal didn't seem to be made of flesh and blood. There was something about the way its figure flickered on the screen that suggested it was supernatural. Its presence was heavy, almost suffocating, and its gaze seemed to pierce through the soul. Emma, visibly disturbed, tried to communicate with the creature through the EVP, but only static noise echoed in response. Suddenly, the tent began to shake violently. It was as if something or someone was trying to rip it from the ground. We looked at each other in terror. Whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. Emma grabbed the flashlight. I ordered, but before she could reach it, the lights around us went out completely, plunging us into an abyss of darkness. In the midst of the darkness, we could hear heavy footsteps around the tent, as if someone was slowly, deliberately circling us, watching us. I knew it wasn't human. The air grew cold, and a sense of despair began to take hold of me. Suddenly, we heard a low guttural growl. It was the dog, closer than ever. With trembling hands, I finally managed to turn on the flashlight. The light swept through the inside of the tent, but when I pointed it at the opening, the dog was no longer there. However, something even more unsettling awaited us. Outside, a tall and imposing figure was standing. It was Heinrich Puth, or what was left of him. His face was a mask of despair and loneliness, with eyes that seemed to plead for something unattainable. Shadows writhed around him as if the darkness itself had come to life. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation for what we were witnessing, but there was no logic here. We were facing the inexplicable, pure terror. Heinrich's figure raised a bony hand and pointed directly at us. At that moment, the tent began to disintegrate, as if it was being consumed by an invisible fire. Emma screamed, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. We were in real danger. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her out of the tent while David was already running ahead of us. But as we crossed the tree line that bordered the garden, the silence suddenly returned, as if we had stepped into another world. I looked back and saw the villa intact, as if nothing had happened. However, we knew the truth. That night, Villa Puth had shown us its darkest side. Heinrich Puth and his ghostly dog were not just legends. They were real, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering and anger, wandering for an eternity without peace. When we returned to our office to review the recordings, we found that all the cameras had stopped working at the exact moment the tent began to shake. No physical evidence remained to tell the story of what really happened that night. Only our memories, and the certainty that we would never be alone again, no matter where we were. That was the last time we investigated Villa Puth. Some stories are better left unanswered, buried along with the dead who still live them. Report 2. The night was dark, with only the light of the full moon peeking through the thick clouds, when a group of young people decided to venture into Villa Puth. It was an urban legend that everyone in Blankenstein knew, but few had the courage to challenge. Mike, Sarah, Chris, and Jenna were longtime friends, and like typical young people, they thought they could laugh in the face of danger. The idea of exploring a supposedly haunted mansion seemed like the perfect opportunity for some adrenaline and fun. They arrived at Villa Puth around midnight, the time when legends claimed that the spirit of Heinrich Puth and his ghostly dog would appear. The villa loomed before them, imposing and shrouded in shadows, with its windows like empty eyes silently observing the group as they approached. The vegetation around the villa seemed to have a life of its own, as if nature was trying to swallow the house, hiding it from the outside world. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying a hint of fear. She was the most skeptical in the group, but also the most sensitive. Mike, the self-proclaimed leader, laughed and patted her on the shoulder. "Don't be such a scaredy cat, Sarah. It's just an old house. What could go wrong?" He waved to the others, and together they pushed open the rusty gate, which squealed in protest, as if the villa itself was trying to dissuade them from entering. The atmosphere grew heavier as they crossed the yard towards the main entrance. The air was thick, almost tangible, and the sounds of the forest around them seemed distant, muffled, as if Villa Puth existed in a bubble separated from reality. Jenna, with her camera in hand, recorded everything, determined to capture any supernatural evidence that might arise. As soon as Mike pushed open the front door, a creaking sound echoed through the house, followed by a deep, eerie noise that seemed to come from the bowels of the villa. The group entered, lighting their way with flashlights. The interior was dusty and dark, with furniture covered in white sheets that looked more like resting ghosts. The temperature dropped drastically, and an unsettling feeling of being watched gripped them all. "Let's split up and explore the rooms," Mike suggested bravely. "Jenna and I will go upstairs, and you two can check the basement." The idea of splitting up sent a shiver down Chris's spine, but he didn't want to seem like a coward, so he agreed. While Mike and Jenna climbed the spiral staircase, Sarah and Chris headed towards the basement. Every step they took made the floorboards creak, and the sound echoed through the house, heightening the feeling that they were intruding on something forbidden. When they reached the basement door, a strong smell of mold and something else, something rotten, invaded their nostrils. Sarah hesitated, but Chris turned the knob and descended the creaky steps. The basement was darker than it should have been. The walls were covered in mold, and the air was heavy and damp. As they lit the area with their flashlights, they noticed a series of old objects scattered across the floor: dusty boxes, rusty tools, and what appeared to be an overturned rocking chair. Sarah crouched to examine one of the items when she heard a whisper. A low, indistinct sound, but definitely human. She looked at Chris, but he was staring fixedly into a corner of the basement. "Chris, did you hear that?" she whispered, fear beginning to creep into her voice. But Chris didn't respond. He stood still, staring into the darkness as if hypnotized. Sarah slowly approached him, calling his name, but before she could touch him, he screamed and backed away, stumbling and falling to the ground. Someone was watching me," he said, gasping. "Right there, in the corner." Sarah pointed the flashlight in the direction Chris indicated, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. But then they heard footsteps slowly approaching. causing them to turn abruptly. The steps of the basement began to creak, one by one, as if someone was descending, but they couldn't see anyone. Meanwhile, Mike and Jenna had entered one of the rooms upstairs. The room was dusty and covered in cobwebs, but something was different. There was a wooden chair positioned in the center of the room, with deep scratch marks on the floor around it, as if it had been dragged to that spot. The window was open, and a cold breeze blew in, making the curtains sway like skeletal hands trying to grasp something. "This is weird," Jenna murmured, filming everything. "Who would leave a chair like that in the middle of the room?" But before Mike could respond, the room's door slammed shut with a loud bang, all on its own. Jenna ran to the door and tried to open it, but it was locked, as if something or someone on the other side was holding the knob. Suddenly, the chair began to rock on its own, a slow, steady movement, accompanied by a slight creaking that sounded almost human, like a moan of pain. Mike and Jenna froze, unable to move or speak. Then, as if by some invisible force, the walls began to close in, as if the room were shrinking around them. Back in the basement, Sarah and Chris were struggling to get out, but the door was also locked. The footsteps around them grew louder, echoing from all directions. Sarah, panicking, began to scream for help, but her voice seemed to be absorbed by the oppressive silence of the basement. Then they saw it, the figure of a man tall and thin, emerging from the shadows. His eyes were as black as the night, and a distorted smile formed on his face as he slowly approached. "Who are you?" Chris shouted, trying to stay calm, but his voice trembled. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed to the stairs. The steps began to disintegrate, as if being consumed by some invisible force, completely blocking their way out. Suddenly, the entire basement was engulfed in complete darkness. Sarah grabbed Chris's hand, feeling her heart race as fear consumed them. They heard a growl, low and menacing, and felt a warm breath on their necks. Slowly, they turned and saw the red eyes of the ghostly dog, glowing in the darkness. Upstairs, the tension was mounting. The chair stopped rocking, but the air around them seemed to vibrate with an eerie energy. Jenna was sweating with fear, her eyes wide with terror as Mike desperately tried to open the door. Then, without warning, the flashlight beams flickered and went out. "Jenna, stay close to me," Mike said, but when he reached out for her, he found only empty space. "Jenna." His voice echoed in the darkness, but there was no response. He fumbled in the dark, feeling panic rising in his chest. When he finally found her, she was cold, motionless. "Jenna." He turned the flashlight back on, and what he saw made him recoil in horror. Jenna was standing there, but her eyes were glassy, lifeless. She didn't respond, didn't move. She just stood there, like a statue, her lips murmuring something incomprehensible. "Jenna, what's happening?" But before he could do anything, the door flew open violently, and an invisible force pushed him out of the room, throwing him into the hallway. He fell onto his back, feeling a sharp pain, but there was no time to recover. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, faster and faster, as if something was running towards him. Mike jumped up and ran. With each step he took, the walls seemed to close in more and more, as if the house was trying to trap him. He raced down the stairs, feeling a cold presence on his back, almost touching his skin. When he reached the entrance hall, he found Sarah and Chris, gasping for breath, their faces pale with fear. "We need to get out of here now," he shouted, and together they ran for the door. But when they reached it, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the villa had decided they would never leave. Suddenly, the lights in the house began to flicker, and a loud metallic sound echoed throughout the place, as if a bell was ringing somewhere far away. The sound grew louder, filling every space in the villa, and then, as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. The group looked at each other, despair evident on their faces. That's when they realized the villa was alive, and they were its prisoners. "This can't be happening," Chris murmured, his voice trembling. "This can't be real." But it was real. The door in front of them slowly opened, revealing the darkness outside. They hesitated, but they had no choice. They ran out, stumbling in the dark, without looking back. The sound of footsteps still echoed behind them, but it grew fainter and fainter, until it finally stopped. When they reached the gate, the panic gave way to a strange sense of relief. They were outside. They had made it. But something was wrong. They looked around and noticed that they were no longer in the villa's yard. They were back in the basement, the walls closing in around them, and the tall, thin figure was smiling now, even closer. "You will never leave here," the figure whispered, and the darkness enveloped them once more. The next morning, the villa was as silent as ever. The townspeople passed by as usual, but something seemed different. No sound, no light, only emptiness. In the yard where the youths had set up camp, there was no sign of life. Only Jenna's camera remained, still recording, showing the images of an empty room, a rocking chair, and a shadow of something moving along the walls. The fate of Mike, Sarah, Chris, and Jenna remained a mystery. The villa never gave up its secrets. And Villa Puth, silent and gloomy, continued to haunt the dreams of those who dared to challenge its darkness, keeping its secrets buried in the eternal endless corridors. Report 3. The full moon rose high in the sky, casting its silver light on the sleeping town of Blankenstein. The night was still, almost unnaturally quiet, when Laura and Tom Parker decided to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary in an unusual way, something neither of them would ever forget. Instead of a romantic dinner or a trip to some paradisiacal location, they chose an adventure full of adrenaline, spending the night in the infamous Villa Puth. Laura had always been the braver of the pair, a lover of danger and intense emotions. Tom, though more cautious, couldn't resist his wife's enthusiasm and eventually agreed to the plan. Villa Puth, with its history steeped in mystery and horror, seemed like the perfect place to satisfy the couple's thirst for adventure. The legend of the villa fascinated them. It was said that Heinrich Puth, the entrepreneur who built the house in the 19th century, still wandered through the corridors and gardens, accompanied by his ghostly dog. Many locals swore they had seen dark figures in the windows and heard inexplicable noises coming from inside the house, but few dared to approach, let alone enter. When Laura and Tom arrived at the villa that night, they were greeted by the cold wind that blew through the trees, as if nature itself was warning them to stay away. But with nervous laughter and hands intertwined, they ignored the ominous feeling and crossed the rusty iron gate that led to the garden of Villa Puth. The villa loomed before them, imposing and silent, with its dark windows and ivy-covered facade. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine but said nothing. Laura, on the other hand, was visibly excited, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "This will be a night to remember," she said, pulling Tom toward the main door. The villa's door, though old and weathered by time, opened effortlessly as if inviting them in. The interior was dark and dusty, the air heavy and humid. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the corridors, creating an increasingly uncomfortable feeling. "Let's explore the upstairs," Laura suggested, already climbing the creaky wooden staircase. Tom followed her closely, looking around, trying to familiarize himself with the surroundings. The silence was oppressive, as if the house was waiting for something. They reached the second floor and entered one of the bedrooms. The furniture was covered with sheets, and the air was cold, much colder than it should have been. Laura approached the window and looked outside, where the garden seemed even more somber under the faint moonlight. "Do you feel that?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Feel what?" Laura responded without taking her eyes off the window. "This feeling. Like someone is watching us." Laura laughed, trying to ease the growing tension she felt inside. "It's just your imagination, Tom. We're in an old, creepy house. It's normal to get the chills." But deep down, Laura was also beginning to feel uneasy. The atmosphere was stifling, as if something invisible was hovering over them. Suddenly, a low, continuous sound filled the room, as if someone were dragging something heavy down the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Tom asked, now visibly nervous. Laura nodded, and both turned toward the door. The sound continued, coming from the hallway. Tom pulled a flashlight from his backpack and turned it on, illuminating the direction of the noise. With their hearts pounding, They opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The sound stopped immediately as they entered the hallway. Everything was silent except for their quick breaths. Tom shone the flashlight on the floor, searching for the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway stretching out before them. "Let's go back downstairs," Tom suggested, increasingly feeling that this was no longer a good idea. Laura nodded in agreement, and the two began descending the stairs again. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, they realized that something was terribly wrong. The flashlights began to flicker, and the temperature in the entrance hall dropped drastically. A distant sound, like a moan, filled the air, echoing through the corridors. The sound was faint but carried the weight of pain and suffering, making the hairs on the back of Tom's neck stand on end. "This isn't right, Laura. We need to get out of here now." Tom grabbed Laura's hand and tried to lead her toward the exit, but as they approached the door, it slammed shut with a loud bang, as if an invisible force had closed it. The sound reverberated through the house, and the moaning grew louder, coming closer. Desperate, Tom tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it was locked from the inside, trapping them in the villa. Laura, who had maintained her composure until now, began to panic. "Tom, what's happening?" Laura's voice was filled with fear, something he had never heard from her before. "I don't know, but we need to find another way out." Tom grabbed the flashlight and began searching for another door or window that could be opened, but everything was locked, as if the villa had turned into a prison. Suddenly, the flashlights went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. Laura clung to Tom's hand, her fingers trembling as they tried to orient themselves in the dark. Then they heard footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps that drew closer with every step. "Who's there?" Tom shouted, but there was no response. Only the footsteps, getting closer and closer. And then they saw it. At the end of the hallway, a tall, gaunt figure appeared, its features obscured by shadows. But what caught their attention the most was the dog at its side, its eyes glowing with an intense red, fixed on the couple. Tom and Laura instinctively backed away, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, with no end in sight. The figure began to move toward them, its steps echoing like a death knell. The dog, with its hellish eyes, growled softly, a sound that seemed to reverberate within the walls, as if the villa itself was alive and hunting them. Tom tried to pull Laura into one of the side rooms, but something caused him to trip. He fell to the floor, feeling a sharp pain shooting through his leg. Laura knelt beside him, desperate, but before she could help him up, the figure and the dog were upon them. The darkness closed in around them, and the last thing Tom saw was the dog lunging at him, its teeth gleaming in the darkness before everything became a blur. He heard Laura's scream, but it seemed distant, as if she were being pulled into another dimension. The pain in his leg was unbearable, and he felt something warm trickling down, blood. Everything went silent. Time seemed to stand still. When Tom finally managed to open his eyes, the figure and the dog were gone, but the hallway looked completely different. The walls were covered in scratch marks, as if something had fought fiercely to get out. The front door was open, swaying gently in the cold wind blowing in from outside. Laura lay beside him, unconscious, with deep scratch marks on her arms and face. Tom, racked with pain, crawled over to her and tried to wake her up. "Laura, please wake up." She didn't move. Tom, struggling against the pain, managed to stand up, leaning against the wall for support. He knew he needed to get out of there, but he couldn't leave Laura behind. With a strength he didn't know he had, he carried her to the door and out of the villa. The cold wind hit him like a breath of fresh air, but he didn't stop. He continued dragging himself to the gate, his steps faltering as blood dripped from his injured leg. The feeling of being watched never left him, and he knew that, although he couldn't see it, something was following them, hidden in the shadows. When they finally reached the car, Tom placed Laura in the back seat and drove off, leaving Villa Puth behind, but knowing that something had followed them, something that would never let them be at peace. Days later, in the hospital, Laura finally woke up. But the look in her eyes was no longer the same. There was something dark there, something Tom couldn't understand. She didn't speak about what happened that night, and whenever he asked her about it, she would only stare at him in silence, her eyes filled with an inexplicable melancholy. Tom's leg healed, but the scars of that night remained etched in his soul. He began having recurring nightmares, always with the same tall, gaunt figure and the dog with red eyes, watching him waiting. Laura, on the other hand, began to exhibit strange behavior, as if she were being controlled by something beyond her will. She would spend hours staring into nothingness, and sometimes Tom would hear her murmuring things in a language he didn't understand. Their marriage was never the same. The house, which had once been filled with laughter and love, became cold and gloomy, and the presence they had felt that night in Villa Puth seemed to have followed them, embedding itself in their lives. No one ever believed their stories. To others, they were just a couple who had gone through a traumatic accident. But Tom knew the truth. Villa Puth had marked them, and its dark spirit was now a part of their lives. He would never be the same again, and every night when he closed his eyes, he knew that Heinrich Puth and his ghostly dog were still watching him, waiting for the moment to take him to where Laura already seemed to be. Villa Puth wasn't just a haunted house. It was a prison for lost souls, and Tom knew that sooner or later, he would be the next one who would never escape again. Report 4. The plane pierced through the gray sky as we approached Germany, a land full of ancient stories and dark secrets. My name is John Harris, and I am a paranormal investigator with over 15 years of experience in cases that defy logic. My team, consisting of 3 of the best specialists in the field, Michael, a technician for advanced equipment, Linda, a sensitive medium, and Alex, an analyst of unexplained phenomena, was ready to face what is said to be one of the most haunted places in the world, Villa Puth. I had read about the villa in several reports and articles. Heinrich Puth, the entrepreneur who built the house in the 19th century, was at the center of many local legends. It was said that his spirit, along with that of a ghostly dog with red eyes, still roamed the grounds of the villa, haunting anyone who dared to approach. Villa Puth was a magnet for ghost hunters and the curious, but few emerged unscathed, physically or mentally, from the experience. The decision to investigate Villa Puth was not an easy one. Over the years, our team had explored places that others would avoid. We had faced forces that no science could explain, and each team member carried scars, both visible and invisible. But something about Villa Puth called to us. There was an urgency to uncover the mysteries of this place, as if the villa itself was luring us into its dark corridors. We arrived in Germany in the late afternoon, and the gloomy weather seemed fitting for what awaited us. Blankenstein was a small town, almost forgotten by time, and Villa Puth was located on the outskirts, far from the rest of civilization. When we finally saw the villa, a shiver ran down my spine. The house was enormous, with architecture that spoke of bygone eras. Its walls were covered in ivy, and the windows looked like dark eyes, watching us with silent malice. "So this is it," Michael said as he adjusted his equipment. "It looks even creepier than I imagined." Linda was silent, her eyes fixed on the villa. "There's an energy here," she murmured. "Something old and unsettling." "Let's set up camp first," I said, trying to stay calm. "We need to prepare before we go in." We pitched our tents in the garden, near the spot where reports indicated the most paranormal activity occurred. The air was cold, and an oppressive atmosphere seemed to surround us as night fell. The sky was covered in clouds, and the full moon barely managed to pierce the darkness. "John, are you sure we should be doing this?" Alex asked, his voice tinged with concern. He was the youngest on the team, but he had seen enough to know that we weren't dealing with just a simple ghost story. "We have to do this," I replied, trying to sound confident. "We're here to find the truth. We need to be ready for anything." As the night progressed, we began to prepare our equipment. Michael set up infrared cameras around the villa, while Linda focused on sensing the presence of any spirits. Alex and I studied the house's blueprints, devising a plan for the investigation. As midnight approached, we were ready. The silence around us was absolute, as if even the sounds of nature had been muted. We entered the villa, our flashlights cutting through the dense darkness. The smell of mold and decay was strong, and every step we took made the floor creak, echoing through the corridors. "This is strange," Michael said as he checked his equipment. I'm picking up an unusual amount of electromagnetic interference. Something here is messing with our gear. Maybe it's Heinrich's spirit, Linda suggested in a whisper. He doesn't want us here. We continued our exploration, delving deeper into the villa's corridors. The rooms were dusty, the furniture covered in white sheets. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the former occupants had simply vanished, leaving their lives behind. But there was something else. Something we couldn't see but knew was there, watching us. When we reached the second floor, things started to get weird. The lights from our flashlights began to flicker, and shadows seemed to move at the edges of our vision. Linda suddenly stopped, clutching her head as if in pain. "Something's wrong here," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a presence, very strong. It's not just Heinrich." Before I could respond, a loud metallic noise echoed through the house, as if something had been knocked over. We ran toward the sound and found a room where the furniture had been tossed around, as if a whirlwind had blown through. "There's no one here," Alex said nervously as he looked around. "What's going on?" At that moment, Linda began to tremble uncontrollably. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed to her knees, muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. We rushed to help her, but something stopped us. A shadow, tall and gaunt, appeared in the doorway. It had no defined form, but it radiated an aura of pure malevolence. The shadow moved slowly toward us, and I felt a primal fear, something I had never experienced before. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, but before we could move, the shadow vanished, and Linda fell unconscious to the floor. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the sound of footsteps echoed around us, as if we were surrounded. Michael and Alex picked up Linda and carried her out of the room while I tried to stay calm and find a way out. When we finally made it out of the villa, the air outside seemed even colder than before. We placed Linda in one of the tents, and she woke up minutes later, but she was different. Her eyes were empty, and she didn't say a word. "She's in shock," Michael said as he tried to calm her down. "Something happened in there, something we don't understand." We decided to spend the rest of the night outside the villa, hoping that morning would bring some clarity. But the night was far from peaceful. With every hour that passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The cameras captured strange movements in the shadows, and the sound of footsteps continued to echo through the garden, even though no one was there. Then, just before dawn, it happened. We were all awake, trying to figure out what to do next, when a terrible scream pierced the air. It was Alex. He had walked away to get something from the van, and when we ran to him, we found his body lying lifeless on the ground. It looked as if he had fallen from a great height, but we were in the middle of the garden. "There's nothing here he could have climbed," Michael said, perplexed. "How did this happen?" Alex was still breathing but unconscious. His body was twisted in a strange way, and his eyes were closed as if he were trapped in a terrible nightmare. We tried to revive him, but he didn't respond. We took Alex to the nearest hospital, but the doctors were as baffled as we were. He was in a deep coma, and none of the tests could explain what had happened. It was as if his mind had simply shut down, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. We returned to the United States, but nothing was ever the same. Linda was never the same, her eyes still empty, as if a part of her had stayed in that villa. Alex remained in a coma, trapped in a state between life and death. And I was left to carry the burden of what had happened. Villa Puth was not just a haunted house. It was a gateway to something much darker, something I should never have tried to understand. Heinrich's spirit, the dog with the red eyes. They were only part of something much bigger, something that lurks in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to catch us. What happened in that villa cannot be explained by any science. We were drawn there like moths to a flame, and we paid the price for our curiosity. Now, every night, I feel something watching me, something that never left us, something that followed us home. And I know that one day, it will come to finish what it started. And when that happens, there will be no escape. Villa Puth is more than just a mansion. It's a warning, a reminder that there are things in this world we should not tamper with. And we, fools that we were, ignored that warning. Now we are trapped in an endless nightmare, waiting for the inevitable end that the villa has reserved for us. Report 5. I've never been a superstitious person, I've always viewed life in a practical and straightforward manner. My job as a delivery driver is simple: pick up packages and deliver them. Nothing complicated, right? At least, that's what I thought until that day. The day when everything changed, and I realized that there are things in this world that can't be explained by logic. For years, I took the same route, passing by the old Villa Puth, a decaying mansion on the outskirts of town. It was a place everyone knew, but no one dared to approach. They said the villa was haunted by the ghost of Heinrich Puth and his dog with red eyes. But to me, it was just another old house, a story to scare children. Every day, I drove by with my dog Bob. He was my inseparable companion, always sitting in the passenger seat, tongue out, as happy as ever. Bob and I were inseparable, and he made the long hours of work more bearable. And although I had never paid much attention to the mansion, I couldn't deny that every time we passed by, I felt a strange chill. It was as if something or someone was watching us, but I never gave it much thought, until that day. It was an afternoon like any other. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle was falling as I made my deliveries. Bob was with me, as usual, and as we approached Villa Puth, he began to get restless. It wasn't the first time he'd been nervous near the mansion, but that day was different. When I stopped the car to check a package, Bob jumped out of the open window and ran towards the mansion. "Bob, come back!" I shouted, but he didn't listen. It was as if he was possessed by an energy I couldn't understand, running towards the house as if something was calling him. I left the car with the door open and ran after him. The gate to Villa Puth, which always seemed locked and rusty, was mysteriously ajar. Bob disappeared into the darkness beyond the gate, and my heart began to race. Something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't leave my best friend alone in that place. I went through the gate and entered the garden. The atmosphere changed instantly. The air was dense, heavy, as if breathing was difficult. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps on the wet grass. I looked around, but Bob was nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed distorted, as if time and space weren't behaving as they should. "Bob, where are you, boy?" I called out, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. I kept walking, my fear growing with every step. Then I saw him in the distance, standing at the entrance of the mansion, wagging his tail as if he was playing with someone. "Bob, we need to get out of here," I said, but he didn't move. As I got closer, I saw what was causing his excitement. There was another dog, a large black dog with eyes that glowed a deep red. The dog stood there, staring at Bob, who was playing around him as if he were his new friend. I approached more slowly, gripped by an inexplicable fear. The black dog wasn't like any other dog I'd ever seen. Its form seemed to flicker, as if it was trapped between this world and another. Its red eyes pierced me, and I knew at that moment that this was no ordinary dog. I tried to grab Bob, but as I got closer, the black dog growled, a deep guttural sound that made my blood run cold. Bob looked at me as if confused, but continued to play with the shadow beside him. And then I saw him, a tall, thin figure emerging from the shadows of the mansion. His face was shrouded in darkness, but his eyes, those eyes glowed with a malevolence that paralyzed me. It was Heinrich Puth. It had to be. He moved slowly closer, as if floating, and the black dog growled louder, advancing a little towards me. Panic overcame me. I knew I had to get Bob out of there, but my legs felt like lead. "Leave my dog alone," I shouted, trying to sound brave, but my voice trembled. Suddenly, Bob jumped back, barking at the black dog. It seemed he finally sensed the danger, and as I tried to grab him, I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I looked and saw that the black dog had bitten me, its sharp teeth sinking deep into my flesh. The pain was unbearable, and fear consumed me. "Bob, run!" I managed to shout as I pulled my arm away, but the black dog wouldn't let go, and its red eyes remained fixed on mine, as if trying to drag me into that endless darkness. Finally, with a last burst of strength I didn't know I had, I managed to break free and pick Bob up in my arms. I ran without looking back, feeling the weight of Heinrich's gaze on my back. I knew that if I stopped, even for a second, I would never get out of that place. We crossed the gate, and as soon as we did, It slammed shut with a loud bang. The sound echoed through the garden, and when I looked back, the mansion was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But my arm throbbed, and when I looked at where the dog had bitten me, I saw the marks of its teeth, deep black and burning like fire. I managed to get back to the car and drove like a madman home, with Bob trembling as much as I was beside me. The pain in my arm didn't go away, and the mark left by the dog never disappeared. It was as if that thing had left a part of itself in me, a permanent reminder of what had happened in that garden that day. Since then, I've never gone near Villa Puth again. I changed my delivery route, and Bob, well, he was never the same either. He refuses to go near any gate or fence, always looking around fearfully, as if expecting to see those red eyes again. I don't know what happened that day, but I know I'll never forget it. I feel like Heinrich Puth and his dog are still there, waiting, watching, ready to drag anyone who approaches into that dark, lifeless place where they remain. And the scar on my arm? It's proof that some stories aren't just legends. They're warnings, and I was lucky to escape with my life. But not everyone is so lucky. If you liked this video, don't forget to support us with a like. And more importantly, if you've had a supernatural experience, don't keep it to yourself. Write your story in the comments below. Share your encounter with the unexplained, feed the collective curiosity, and who knows, maybe together we can uncover these mysteries that linger like fog between the world of the living and the dead. Remember, the unknown is always lurking, just a story away. And now, as night falls, who knows what shadows might emerge from the darkness to whisper yet another true horror story. A true horror story that chills our blood and reminds us that the darkness is full of secrets better left undiscovered. Villa Puth is just one example of how close the supernatural can sometimes be, even when we can't see it. There are places in this world where the boundary between this life and the next is thin, where the ghosts of the past still wander, waiting for those who dare to disturb their rest. I now know that the stories about Villa Puth aren't just fabrications but dark truths buried deep in the shadows. My encounter has taught me that there are things we cannot explain, forces beyond our understanding that are just waiting to reveal themselves when we least expect it. For those who have never experienced the unexplained, the warning stands. Sometimes it's better to take stories of hauntings and ghosts at face value, as warnings of a world we do not understand. But if you ever feel someone or something watching you from the darkness, trust your gut. Maybe it's just an old legend. Or maybe it's the truth, hidden in the shadows, ready to pull us into the abyss from which there is no escape. Stay vigilant, my friends. The unknown always lurks in the darkness, and sometimes, it's closer than we think.